Okay, let's go get started today. Welcome everybody to this collaborative webinar between Underscore and Gettysburg College, who's one of our great clients. Before we get started, please know that the webinar is being recorded and we're going to share following the event. We're grateful you're here to join us and we welcome your questions at the conclusion of the webinar. But if at any point you do have any questions you'd like to submit, feel free to put them in the Q&A down below. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started with introductions. My name is Ted Magdzinski. I'm the Director of Slate Communications here at Underscore. To provide my background, I've spent my entire career in higher education, primarily in admissions, both for a small liberal arts college as well as a large flagship university. I've been at Underscore for about 2.5 years now. Before that, I implemented Slate at my previous institution, both for grad and undergrad at the University of Cincinnati. I also work closely with Maggie and the rest of the Gettysburg College team on their Slate instance, and more specifically their communications as it pertains to search. I'll let Maggie introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm so glad to be here presenting with Ted today. As Ted mentioned, my name is Maggie Karpauskas, and I'm Associate Director of Admissions at Gettysburg College. I've been in college admissions for 7 years, spending the last 5 of them at my alma mater, Gettysburg College. And in the admissions office, I serve primarily in 2 roles. I manage all of our admissions communications, working very closely and collaboratively with our Office of Communications and Marketing on campus. And I'm also a Slate captain. I've been a Slate captain in the admissions office since we acquired Slate, and we began our implementation 2 years ago. And because of these 2 hats that I wear, I work very closely with our Dean of Admissions as well as the Underscore team on our search campaigns that we run out of Slate. Before diving into the presentation, Ted and I just wanted to offer a little bit of background on both of our institutions. So for those who may not be familiar, Gettysburg College is a nationally ranked college of the liberal arts and sciences located in the world famous historic town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We're about an hour outside of Baltimore and about 90 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. Our 2,600 undergraduate students come from 40 states and 33 countries. In fact, the majority of our student body is from outside the state of Pennsylvania. Only about a quarter come from PA. And we're a residential campus with approximately 95% of our students living on campus for all 4 years. In terms of admission, we are a more selective college with an acceptance rate right around 45%. This year, we received nearly 6,400 applications for admission. And our incoming class last year was right around 681 academically talented students. 38% of those students enrolled through early decision. We conduct a holistic application review as part of our admissions process, and we award academic merit scholarships as part of that process. So last year, our incoming class, about 65% of those students were receiving some form of financial aid. Just to provide a little bit of additional context on our recruitment process in the admissions office, we have 13 administrative staff members who manage recruitment territories both in the United States and abroad. And we serve as points of contact for students to assist them in their search to find a college as well as to build our incoming class every year. In addition to the travel that we do, campus visits and our communications, we utilize student search as an additional tool to reach out to students. The year that we implemented Slate, which was 2018, is also the year that we decided to partner with Underscore and to bring our search in-house.
And to give you a little bit of background on Underscore, we're the country's largest dedicated Slate development and optimization company. We're formed specifically to assist schools that utilize Slate, which Gettysburg is one of. And we were the first platinum preferred partner of Technolutions, which became one of their initiatives just about a year ago. I think one of the things we're most proud of is really our Slate staff. As of right now, we have 11 full-time members of what we call our Slate squad. We've all worked in Slate at our previous institutions. We've all worked in admissions on the higher ed side. We all have various backgrounds and skill sets within Slate. I think that's one of the things that we find most rewarding is many of you that do work on your college campus and like having those conversations that are dedicated to Slate with all the people around you. We get to do that every day. And that's, definitely a rewarding part of it. In addition to our Slate team as well, we have an award-winning creative staff who can provide additional content, both copy and design for our clients as well. So we provide everything for the schools to run not only development of Slate, implementations, but also, the communication side of it as well. And kind of moving forward, one of the things we really like to focus on, and really what we were founded on, was the idea of providing, the concept of insourcing to our schools. So if you're familiar with outsourcing, obviously with search, it's a very popular component of it is outsourcing your student search to have a third party run anything from the name buys to the communications to the analytics and everything in between of running a search campaign. And really, as we focus on search, the idea that you can do that in Slate and do it much more effectively, much more cost effectively, really is why we started doing what we do. Because it is one of those things that you can do it just as well and in a lot of ways better than what you had done previously. So to kind of give you some idea in terms of what that would look like, obviously having your CRM, sending data back and forth with a vendor, having consistent emails and communications, and not really being fully aware of what was going on the other side of it. And even if you were having to log into additional CRMs or portals or anything in between, that was kind of the traditional way of doing it. And now with the way you can insource all of your student search process within Slate, nothing has to necessarily leave. And that's an important part of it because we want to make sure you have as much control and ownership and oversight of your search campaigns as you would anything else within your Slate environment. So as we kind of begin our conversations about search, it does help to put some context into why we do what we do and why we found specific pain points related to outsourcing. A lot of your processes in admission as it relates to Slate, but especially student search, a lot of it comes down to budget. And as we're obviously having those conversations right now with schools in this kind of gray area of where we're going to be going forward, budget needs and concerns become a bigger issue year over year, and especially right now. Outsourcing student search is an expensive experience. Having another firm, obviously do the name purchases and run everything outside of that, all the communications, all the creative, and having that external side of it makes it a very expensive process. Oftentimes they send, emails individually by emails, what you're actually paying for, not the overall, contract and terms and all of those sorts of things that go into it. And not only that, but if you have an external vendor that utilizes their own CRM or their own portal, that's another business process, another tool that you need to either learn or be familiar with and how they utilize it. And you may not have access to it. We have a number of schools we work with that they've been limited in what data they can pull out of any external search vendor that they've worked with, even though it is essentially their data. So there's a number of reasons why that's obviously cost prohibitive. It becomes much more expensive. A lot of those companies are running their own software, and that's potentially what they charge for. And that's not necessarily the way that it needs to be done. One thing we really always focus on is the data side of things. So as we kind of start talking about data security and the back and forth, and whether you're doing SFTP servers or you're doing flat file data transfers or exports and loading them to an external external drive or anything in between, there are ways to improve that, and the minimal amount of time and times that you can move data back and forth, the better, because anytime you move data, even if you're downloading it directly, obviously from College Board or ACT, you're putting the data at risk. You're putting yourself at risk, you're putting the student data at risk, you're putting the institution at risk. And as much as we can limit that, if names come immediately into Slate and stay there until they go through the entire funnel, and then we run a retention policy after a number of years to remove that, we can limit as much risk as possible going forward. The conversion side of things and weak funnel usage is always one area that we always talk about, and we've had those conversations, especially with Gettysburg, is the timing of having to verify when a student is converted, moving them over, when are they going to fall out of the process into the next inquiry phase, or have they applied, and making sure that data is keeping up to date. That's a difficult thing, and I think one of the advantages of running student search outside of your Slate instance, especially obviously when you partner with somebody like us, is the opportunity to have full oversight constantly of the search process. So you're aware of any rules that go into place, you're aware of any communications that go out, and we can have a very strong funnel going forward, so we're always aware of it. It does relate to what we call pure sourcing as well. So if you set up Slate and from day one you put your origin sources in place, and when you load student names from the SAT or ACT, from day one those students are searched. They've never heard of you before, they've never reached out to you before, they've never visited campus before. You're going to know that any search campaigns and any metrics and any ROI that you have from that is purely because of that campaign, because that they're not in there before. Anytime you have that kind of go-between process of having names in another system, and they may want to count them, even if you already have them in the system and they're communicating, they may want to count them as well. Same thing with obviously the campaign execution, and it really goes into being aware of what's going out on your behalf with your branding, making sure there's no duplicate messaging. I think one of the things that Maggie really appreciates, and I'll speak for her on that, of working with us, is she's able to see everything that we do within her Slate instance. So if she's in there, she knows what's going out, she knows any adjustments that we've made or need to make on certain things, and being aware of exactly where a student is in the process and making sure that we're all on the same page for communications as well as conversions and any rules that you're going to go into that. And again, we can be very responsive. There's been many times that obviously we've emailed each other, we've texted each other and had phone calls at any time to make sure that if something needs to be adjusted for a search component, that can happen, and it can happen very quickly. And having that in an external system where you don't necessarily have access or all the access you feel like you need, that is potentially a roadblock going forward. So as we talk about the traditional approach to search, colleges have often treated it as a one-off, seasonal approach. So there's a lot of times we'll have conversations with schools that want to do their one name by, end of July, beginning of August, and that's it. And they run their student search campaign, and either we run it for them or if they've run it before, they expect it that it'll go, here are all of the emails in a certain order, and then it's pretty much done, and it's very passive. Again, it may be run through a third party where you're not necessarily having any oversight. You may make approvals on certain things, and then it just kind of goes off into the void. And not having an engaged process in the search process for communications, they're not able to do intervention quickly. We've had this conversation with many of our clients, some of which that are on the webinar. Once obviously everything kind of got shut down with COVID, we ended up going in and making sure that any communications, especially for search and visits, that we were shutting down anything that related to on-campus events. We wanted to make sure we were being as responsible as possible, that we weren't sending communications out to students, even on a wide scale, that they shouldn't be coming to campus, that there was maybe a new link and virtual visits and all sorts of things that go into changing your entire visit structure. And so, search should not be a passive approach. It's not something that you're just letting run and having the names come in and there's extra students to load in. There is an opportunity to make it very customized, to make it very long-term growth, and really build out a cohesive plan to really know what kinds of students are coming in, and are you getting the right students every time you run a student search campaign. And as we've started looking at additional campaigns for schools, and with Gettysburg especially, so we've been working with them for about 1.5 years now, officially within their Slate instance, and we're seeing the performance and the changes in what we're seeing with student search and where you should be focusing, and all of those the metrics that go into it. We're seeing a significant increase and a push for students to be communicated to earlier on in the process. So obviously right now with Gettysburg, we're running an underclassmen search that's including both juniors as well as sophomores, and making sure that they are getting consistent, coherent communications as early as possible, because they're actually performing potentially at a much higher rate. They're converting much more highly. They're often applying at higher rates. It's not a passive group. They may take their time actually, making a conversion or again, visiting campus when you're able to, or essentially applying, and we'll show some of that in the data as well. But it is one of those things that the earlier you can get to them, the better, because it is something that students are having much more of a interest in getting communications earlier on, where you're trying to get ahead of the pack. That's not to say that fall search and senior search isn't viable. There's obviously a need for that, but the way you're going to communicate to a student who inquired January 20th of their junior year is very different than the way you want to communicate to a student that took the ACT for the first time in maybe November of their senior year. Those are very different groups, and you want to make sure you're addressing those very differently and communicating in very different ways. And with the underclassmen group, you want to make sure you're getting as much of a conversion and traction as possible before the next spring rolls around, when they're ultimately seniors. And again, as related to that, as we've seen this year, especially those non-responders, so any students that we start communicating to as a junior or potentially sophomore in the spring, they may take their sweet time and not do any inquiry forms or do any visits or really have much interaction at all until after that July 1st, when they're officially a senior, where we kind of push them over. That group may be very viable, and they may need additional communications that are specific to them, that we recognize, hey, you've gotten a lot of communications from us already. You haven't done much, but here's what we can do to provide to make sure that this is something you still are interested in, and trying to get as many conversions as possible. So, it's not something to just say, oh, those students have gotten 30 emails, they're done. Still address them and make sure that they're getting taken care of.
To follow up to some of the points that Ted has been making, I wanted to touch briefly on Gettysburg's approach to search. So like many schools, we outsourced search prior to our partnership with Underscore. That said, we do still maintain a relationship with our former search vendor as they do the initial analysis and purchase of our names each cycle prior to us bringing them into Slate. But in terms of who we're reaching with search, we run both the traditional senior search as well as the underclassmen for juniors and sophomores, adhering to that belief that Ted was talking about, the earlier is better to get in front of students. And this year we're piloting a search campaign specific for international underclassmen as well. So together with Underscore, we developed the communications campaigns that run throughout the course of a year cycle. And we found that in doing so over the past 18 months or so, our close collaboration with Underscore has really allowed us to facilitate a truly seamless transition in our communication sequence from search prospects to inquiries, as well as our ability to include search students in emails that we may already be running for our inquiries. We have increased ability to sort of pick and choose which messages we want students to receive. So in the instance that we may want to repurpose an inquiry email for search, I can quickly reach out to Ted, who will take the email, modify it, and then send it out to the search group. And on the flip side, we might also want to repurpose emails that we've used from previous cycles. And we're able to work together to pinpoint which student segments have already received that, and then to quickly filter them out from those email sends as well. So the final point that I just want to touch on in terms of our approach to search has been our relationship that the admissions office has with our marketing team, our communications and marketing office. So the strength of our relationship that we do have with them has really allowed us to take full advantage of Slate's capabilities to implement an integrated and multi-channel approach to reaching our search students. Once the email campaigns are set with Underscore, we coordinate social media ads that complement the email campaigns. So within Slate, we're able to build digital ad audiences, those queries that we can export, very responsive lists over to Facebook. And then the communications and marketing team is able to run those social ads that correspond to the email messages and campaigns that students are already seeing. We found it super important to be able to meet students where they are, whether that's in their inbox through the search emails that they're receiving, or if that's on social through one of the digital ads that they're receiving there.
So as we kind of looked at the past year and seen, and now we're obviously mostly wrapped up with the full cycle this year, the goal of search essentially is to get more inquiries and get more student interest and ultimately applications and enroll. We always have that same goal. Even if search, really the main purpose of search is to drive student interest, inquiries, engagement. And it's important for a school like Gettysburg, where a significant number of their students do come from out of state. We have to assume that those students have no idea who Gettysburg is until they start getting those communications, until they start reading them, engaging with the website, and doing everything that is sent out to them. We want to make sure that they're provided as much information as possible so they feel comfortable both inquiring, but ultimately applying and then enrolling to the college itself. So as we kind of look at the numbers, what we were seeing was interesting because again, I think the advantage of running it in Slate, especially year over year, is being able to do full comparisons and see how that performance has had, and especially with being, with Gettysburg from the beginning, we're able to see year over year just how those juniors are performing, and ultimately those sophomores, because those non-responding sophomores, we can still pull that data too, and see how those ones have performed all the way up to this point, and keep track of that all throughout. So what we were finding essentially was that 20% of the juniors that became inquiries as part of that junior search in the spring, 20% of those students ended up applying, but even more, I guess, eye-opening really, was the 40% of the non-responders inquiries that ended up applying. So if the students waited and took their time and actually didn't do anything, and for us, we would consider a non-responder that hadn't done anything and hadn't obviously converted and moved down, in person status up until July 1st. After that point, they would be considered obviously an inquiry, but they're going to be a non-responder for the purposes of a spring search campaign and a junior campaign. So we ended up having about 40% of those students end up applying as well. And that's comparison to about 50% of the senior prospects that became inquiries through that process. And as Maggie will get into a little bit, that was not a one-size-fits-all approach either, partly to the fact because we ended up having multiple lists of students coming in at different times, where every other week we would have our conversations and figure out how things were performing, how students were converting, where their applications were coming from, and most importantly, where they weren't. And they were, ended up doing, I think, 5 or 6 different name buys and bringing students in at different points in the timeline. And so I'll let Maggie kind of go into a little bit of that in terms of our adjustments that we had for the fall purpose.
Yeah, the ability to adjust has been really important for us, to be able to be nimble and to pivot when we need to. Of course, strategic enrollment goals help us at Gettysburg College to determine what those search name buys are throughout the year, whether it's the traditional senior search or if we need to segment and buy more names based on demographics or geographic regions. That said, if and when goals do change, or we need to adjust based on what data is telling us, we have that flexibility to be able to bring more names in and to run those drip campaigns to the students. So last fall, for example, we were down in one of our key markets. Although we had already launched our traditional senior search campaign much earlier, we were still able to buy names from a couple of those specific states and then roll them into the drip campaign immediately, which had a big impact on what we saw in terms of the data. We can adjust messaging within drip campaigns as things shift or as things are needed. So as Ted mentioned before with like COVID-19 and maybe needing to adjust messaging based on that, or in the instance that new deadlines approach or their scholarship announcements, that we're able to incorporate that into the sequence that already exists. I think it's pretty easy to say that running search through Slate makes it more of a living and breathing search. We're able to treat the names like inquiries, but at a much broader scale. For instance, we can include search prospects in event invitations, or in today's current climate, virtual event invitations, as well as role search names into communications that we might be sending out with regard to where we're traveling and what we're doing in those areas when we go, to be able to have another touch point with those students if they choose to engage in person. Finally, working directly with Ted and his team on the search communications has made it clearer and easier for us at Gettysburg to understand when students are raising their hand, and how we need to communicate with them once they do become part of our inquiry sequence.
And to kind of go into that a little bit, so, again, our focus for a lot of this, we kind of bounce a little bit between the senior search and the junior search, because we can't ignore the junior search. It's a very important part of it. And I think coming from higher ed and being in that role previously, it's very easy to focus on the current year and let's make sure we make our class and craft it as best as possible. And, especially right now, making sure all those deposits and enrollments come in. But this is also an opportune time to focus on those juniors and make sure that we're providing information and access to them that they need at this point, so that we're not in a similar situation next year with any school, and make sure that they have what they need going forward, especially as our environment is constantly changing. So one of the things we always recommend is saving those budget dollars for underclassmen. We've had multiple conversations this year that some schools, they've spent all of their budget dollars committed to search on the senior class and not nearly enough as they would like on the junior class, at least until it opens back up, at least until they have some additional dollars to spend, or after the fiscal year or anything like that. We want to make sure that that's an opportunity to say that's a group to really focus on, because the long-term investment will be worth it. There are opportunities, obviously, with an ACT to set up a continuous delivery option, so you can have it essentially standing orders, drop in anytime there's new names that come in. Those are going to be smaller lists. They're smaller names, they're smaller test dates, and the students that are actually interested in that may not be getting communications from anyone else if they're later in the process and they haven't been bought previously. And that is an important part of it as well. We often recommend to put as much effort and dollars into the junior search as you would for senior search. Again, because your performance may actually be higher for junior search, depending on the number of students you get and where you're getting them from, making sure that is a group to put some investment towards. And even with that group that are coming in as juniors, segmentation is still very important. We still try to do that as much as we can for search names. Obviously, the data we get from the name by files are It's relatively limited. It's typically bio-demo data. There may be some first-gen information depending on the source. There may be some other information on GPA that we might have. Obviously, academics is sometimes part of it. As much as you can to segment communications and run those, whether it's using snippets or liquid markup. If a student has already visited campus or done a virtual tour, changing the call to action for that student to not to kind of push into the same thing. Or if they've already submitted an inquiry form, change the call to action so they're not getting pushed to submit another inquiry form of the same thing, and really, making it seem like they're being spoken to in a way that is, relevant and timely, because they have seen a lot of these, and as we see on a couple slides later, they do get a lot of communications, especially as juniors. They are receiving a lot, and you want to make sure you're standing out as much as possible. And at the same time, we also want to recommend schools not drop the ball in communications. And when we work with a school on their underclassmen search, and we're communicating to those prospects, really the first thing we're going to ask is, do you want us to continue these communications even when they inquire? So again, removing the call to action, doing some liquid markup and pulling those out so that those students are still getting regular, consistent communications, because the last thing you want to do is have a student inquire on January 20th of their junior year and not receive another email until August 1st when it's time to apply, because you haven't put in the work and nurtured that relationship. They haven't gotten anything additional from you. So you want to make sure that they are continuously getting communications, they're continuously getting invites. Even if you think you have them, it's still a long process. And we want to make sure that you're very aware of every student that's in the process in the funnel and that they're getting communications. And as we go forward a little bit, and again, for all of us at Underscore, when we talk about everything within Slate and utilizing different tools, and as things change, and as I'm sure we'll hear in another month or so, additional updates that we're not even dreaming of yet, there are some tools that would be useful for potentially kind of rolling into your search process. And it's interesting because anytime we do a sort of launchpad or even summit events or various things that we hear, they ask the question like how many people are using Ping or Voyager or various tools within Slate. It is sometimes surprising that there's a lot of schools not using as much as they could, that there's a lot of availability for things that they just haven't seen or had time to tinker around with. And as we know, resources are often low in admission offices, making sure that there is some intent to look around all the different features and see if there is something that you could utilize in a search focus. Voyager is one thing that our enrollment strategy division uses pretty much every time we do search recommendations. Is we'll build out as essentially with Voyager a query. So if you built a query, you can build a Voyager map and essentially do a heat map that shows you any query data that you want to have. And we use it to look at obviously full funnel for previous year searches as well as the current year, see where the students are that you're actually reaching out to from a prospect level, where the students are actually applying. And then if you don't have any students that you're buying in a specific region, but you're getting applications, that's a nice visual way to look at it. You can obviously query that data typically, but having it on a visual component allows you to use trips and overlay your admission staff in terms of the recruiting and see, are they going to the right schools? Are they going to the right places? And also you can implement ACS data, which is already included by Technolutions as an overlay within these maps. And so you can actually see if there are students under specific education levels that are historical to that region or income levels as well. So if you're looking for a very specific type of students you want to start buying in a specific region or market, Voyager is a great tool to really find out, are you buying in the right places? And you can do it again within your own instance without having to have anybody outsource that as well. Slate Print, we've talked about this a lot lately, as you're probably all waiting for that. And if you're in the beta, then you're definitely one step closer. We at Underscore really do think that Slate Print and the new development of that with Scott is going to change really everything that schools do with communications. Because I think bringing that in-house and allowing the ease of the tools to be in there and allowing the school to really run it themselves and have that kind of ownership and that sort of development of small batch print runs for specific students and having variable content without having additional markup, that's going to be significant change. And I think it's going to be a great tool that the sooner you can get involved in that and bring your marketing team in the fold or any other vendors that you have working with as well, so that they're involved in helping, do postcards and brochures. And I'll buy a beer for the first school that chooses to do their view book out of Slate Print once that's live, because that'll be a very interesting experience to see. But I think it'll be one of those things that the more schools do that, the more they're going to see the value in having all of that in-house as much as possible. We've had a number of the schools that we work with already have walkthroughs with Scott. We've had a lot of conversations with them as well, and they're obviously excited to kick it off. So when that goes live, There are obviously certain markets, whether it's search you want to focus on with that group because it is going to be low impact, that there's a little bit less risk with a group like that. Or if you want to focus on those inquiries and those applicants, you can do it at a smaller scale, which will be useful. Ping is one of our favorite features. It's our CEO's favorite feature of Slate. So anytime he gets a chance to talk about Ping, he's very excited to do that. It is one of those things, one of those tools that you should turn on the very first day you have Slate if you haven't done that yet. And being able to track website traffic within Slate and be able to see what student records are going to what pages, how long they're going to these pages, how often they're going to these pages. We use this extensively for search campaigns because it does tell us more than what the typical data gives us. We may get open rates, we may get click rates, we may have obviously inquiry forms and event registrations, but being able to see that a student has spent 10 different times for a full hour on a financial aid page and they're looking at all of the different scholarships available, that's a student that, one, if they haven't inquired, we want to move them to an inquiry so that we are getting much more in front of them. And two, we want a counselor to reach out to them. And so there's a lot of that balance of what kind of data are we getting, how are we using it, and especially with a lot of this on here, especially with Voyager and Ping, the tools are available. It's how do you use it, how do you implement it in not only your search strategy, but any other strategies within Slate. One thing I heard from a marketing conference a number of years ago was there's a very fine line between creepy and cool. And Ping, I think, is one of those because we want to make sure that we're aware that students are interested and we can kind of reach out and send them communication. We're not sending them emails saying, hey, I know you've been on this page 10 times and you should really reach out and inquire. But we want to make sure that they know that we know you're interested in financial aid. So here's some information on that. Or we know you're interested in experiential learning. So here's some information on that. We can make changes to obviously emails with Ping. So if we're seeing that a certain link or a certain landing page or an event form isn't getting the traction we're expecting, that allows us to change either the link or the placement of it. Are we adding buttons or icons? So again, as Mag was alluding to, search is not a passive thing. It should not be, even if you're buying 50,000, 300,000 names, you should be as engaged with it and utilizing as many of the tools as you can to reach out to those students because, as you probably can imagine, they're getting communications from a number of schools, so you're going to want to stand out. As we talk about, where we go from here with what COVID-19 is, and we just saw today that ACT had shut down another, I think, 3,600 testing sites. You're going to still want, obviously, student interest and where you're going to get your prospects for the next year. There are other opportunities to identify students and pull them in, whether you want to classify them as prospects if they're minimal interest, or to you their inquiries because they've done maybe a little bit more of a form. There are some other opportunities here with some of these other vendors and companies that can help provide student data that maybe you don't have. So as we see more schools go test optional, we may see more students obviously not even take any of the tests at all. You want to make sure you're still keeping your prospect pool as large as possible, and there are other opportunities to do that as well.
Before we wrap up and open it up to questions, we thought we'd leave you with a couple last recommendations as you think about search and your search messaging. So stakes are pretty low with this group, so you have to really get creative to get their attention, to cut through the noise of the inbox. As they're, you can see on the slide how many emails might be coming into an inbox at any given point in time. So some ways to do this. First, you could think about your subject lines and what jumps out at students in their inbox, catches their eye, catches their attention. Is it the inclusion of their preferred name? Is it the use of emojis or maybe a really bold statement that then will prompt them to open that email? But thinking beyond the subject line and getting students just purely to open it, but thinking about those call to actions that you're asking students to take within the email. What is a call to action that could compel them to convert to an inquiry? And Ted said this before, but I think it's just really important to stress the importance of tailoring communications to the students. Segmentation and personalization is more important now than ever, especially with Generation Z. It's important to remember to not be stagnant. So continuing to analyze the data, hop on the call with your Underscore team and talking about the data. What is it telling you? How can you strategize to find ways to be more responsive to that data? To test and to try new things within your email campaigns. So we've been testing forms beyond that standard inquiry form that you send out to students. How can we get the attention of students, find out more about them, and then tailor communications, future communications to them specifically? And then finally, I've touched on this before, but if you have a strong relationship with your marketing department, you should really consider coordinating and implementing that integrated multi-channel approach through your search campaign. So if you're able to reach the same students that you've been reaching via email by using digital ads, you may have another opportunity to convert them to an inquiry. While they may not have clicked on a link to the video in the email, they'll see it in a different format in terms of the digital ad on their Facebook page, and they might be more compelled to engage with it there instead. So I'll pass it back to Ted to see if he has anything else to add before we open it up to questions.
Yeah, and I think as we kind of mentioned a little bit, especially with junior search and sophomore is getting creative and taking some risks, because I think they are going to get so many communications. Even if you send out a communication that falls flat, you still have a plenty of time to obviously continue to communicate and reach out to the student as well. We want to make sure that you're being aware of that long-term process of a year and a half for these students that you can potentially communicate to, reach out to, have communications with. So I think as Maggie and I have talked a couple weeks now about how our plan is going to go forward for the fall with senior search and how names are going to get kind of where are we going to do with those, and then again the juniors. That non-responder group, I think, is going to be one thing that we're really going to focus on, that we performed a lot better than I think any of us really expected from that group of students who didn't do anything until this coming July. I think there's going to be opportunity there, especially to do separate communication campaigns specifically to that group, really acknowledging that we know they've gotten a number of emails. We know they've been in our system for a while. We know they may not have done anything, but it's still worth kind of nurturing that relationship. And I think for that group especially, that's one thing we want to really add on to search, where it's search, but at a little bit of a different scale, only because we know they should be familiar at this point. They probably have read some of the emails, even if they haven't done anything, because we are seeing a lot more and more students using their inbox as kind of a Google search, where they're just kind of using that to see what schools are. They may not be interacting with schools, but they're just going to go to the website after their inbox and having some engagement there. And so, again, I think it's always going to be one of those things that we're trying to adjust what we do as much as possible. As especially a tool like Slate grows, we're just waiting as much as you guys for any of the changes that the team at Technolutions is going to introduce over the next several months, because we want to utilize that as much as possible in what we do and learn that and help both ourselves learn it for our purposes, but also for the schools we work with to help leverage some of those tools that come out. And I still get night sweats from the 100 features that Alexander Clark revealed a couple years ago, because that was such a huge initiative of saying, here's all these features to roll in. Now, how are you going to use them in your business process? And what we do within search, how are we going to use certain features like that in what we do? And anytime something gets implemented, we want to make sure we take advantage of that. And we encourage all of the schools to as well, because again, it's a pretty crowded market, and this year is going to be very interesting going forward, that we want to make sure you're doing as much as you possibly can with search. So that wraps up the scheduled portion of this. I'm sorry. Of our webinar. So we do have some questions that we have been getting, and so we'll go ahead and kind of go through a couple and address them as we have some time. I think one of the questions is, if we decide to migrate search over to Slate, how long does it take to get things up and running? Not super long, and if you're talking about doing it internally and just strictly by yourself versus if working in contract now with Underscore, for example, even then it's about a month or so of really maybe 6 weeks turnaround of working through the process. If you have external names that you're loading in as non-responders from an external vendor that you want to bring over, there's obviously some time to get that up and running. And then we work with the school on doing a discovery visit and doing all the communication, creation, all the copy, all the design, stuff like that. On a short-term basis, probably 4 to 6 weeks. If you're doing it themselves, probably maybe about the same. I can't imagine, it's one of those things that would take up a significant portion of time as long as you dedicate the resources to moving search over to Slate. And again, wherever you are in a contract with a third-party vendor, if you've been doing that, how quickly can you get the data that is yours, that is rightfully yours, and bring that over and build a communication plan around it. And then, are you using the same campaigns or deliver or copying over year? So will you overwrite your COVID-19 messaging into the same campaign? And this school struggles with this since the email that shows on the student record shows whatever the current message content is. Yeah, I am a big proponent of redoing emails every year. I don't like having the same email run every year and having the the tickers show all of the different runs of it over several years, because I do think there's an opportunity to refresh it. So even for the schools that we did from day one that we've been working with and started running communications for, I think for us, it's very important that we stay as fresh as possible and refresh those and change copy and make sure, even if it is a refresh, that copy is getting changed, because we don't want to necessarily make it so that, a student could potentially see the same communications, especially as we talk about those underclassmen groups, that those sophomores, coming in now, or coming in from last year, that are now, if they're non-responder, they're now getting this, similar emails, but a different campaign as a junior. And then if they're still non-responders, they're not necessarily getting pulled out, but as a senior, we're going to see this year how those sophomores from last year will end up performing. And that'll be interesting, because we don't want to send communications to them that they've already gotten or similar feel. And so both from design and copy, I definitely recommend doing brand new emails, or at least restructuring everything and reordering, so it feels like a different campaign for them. Maggie, you have a question for, you mentioned that your partnership with Underscore has saved money compared to a previous search vendor. Do you know what you've been able to do with the extra budget dollars?
Well, I would argue, and I think most people on here would argue, that anytime you can save those budget dollars, it's a good thing, just to shore it up and tighten it a little bit. So yes, Gettysburg was able to save some money by partnering with Underscore in terms of switching over to our search vendor. As I did mention before, we're still buying names through our former search vendor. So to some extent, being able to partner with Underscore and then run search in-house has allowed us to expand that name buy a little bit more than we would have been able to before. Ted and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it really doesn't matter if you're sending to one more student or a million more students, but by bringing in whatever scale that is into Slate, you can still have that capability of running search. So being able to save money on the front end allows you to expand a little bit in terms of the names that you're bringing in. Other than that, you can use it for additional communications efforts that you might be doing outside of search, or whatever your budgets are at your different schools. If it's increased travel, maybe not this year, but in future years, that you have a little bit of flexibility there to reallocate that money.
Another question is, what's been the most helpful feature for your campaigns? What isn't the most helpful feature? I mean, I think one of the things as we start doing campaigns is, again, every feature that is available, we want to make sure we exhaust all possibilities so that we're using everything we can within Slate to reach out to students, communicate with them. I think one of the things that we've really started doing lately that I really like is bringing in, our special projects team to help do inquiry portals. So even if they're not doing the admitted student portal and making adjustments to that and changing it, having something that is a different landing page for students at the inquiry phase, kind of providing obviously social media, videos, event invitations, and kind of putting them through that process. I really like that, because I do think it gives them another opportunity to see something different from a website or different from a standard inquiry form that is a little bit unique, of being able to go in and do a brand new kind of landing page that would act as an inquiry portal for them.
I see a question here about search non-responders. So if search non-responders are responding to a non-search email, for example, a visit or event email, how are you acknowledging that in your conversion rates? And I think that's a conversation that you can definitely have with your Underscore team in terms of how you want to treat it, but it's really all in the rules and how you're setting up to switch students over from a prospect status to an inquiry status within your Slate instance. So thinking about what actions you want to drive that movement and that conversion, switching them out of a population that would have been the search population into the inquiry population that you would then be communicating with. And so in the example that's given in this question, if a student is receiving an event invitation and they're registering for that event, taking that action would automatically drop them out of a search campaign for Gettysburg in particular, and then put them into the inquiry sequence. So you have the ability to sort of oversee that and think strategically in terms of how you want to treat that. I don't know, Ted, if you...
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that, being in the same instance and working with the same data, this is probably why my project manager is on the webinar, and it's probably why, my end of campaign reports can get a little lengthy, because as it looks like, and with these kinds of things, you can get very in depth with the data. And obviously we have access to all of the reporting and all the conversions and all the rules that go into it. And so as we're tracking performance of this, obviously we would be aware that they would be getting this communication. So if we're tracking conversion email by email, it may not be search email number 10 that converts them. It may be an event invitation that converts them. We need to accommodate for that. So I think it's, there's a lot that goes into it, and every school's a little bit different because every campaign is very different. And really there's never been a situation where we've done the exact same thing for every school. I don't think we ever want to get to that point that we're, have a cookie cutter approach to it. And so again, it's how, how Gettysburg handles their inquiries and how they move over. Are they using ping or opens or clicks or other metrics to convert students in the funnel? Or is it, a specific event form that moves them over, a specific inquiry form that moves them over? And we've seen that too. So it's a tricky question because I think every school is going to be a little bit different. We do want to count it as somebody who is converted, but exactly what that does for them and which communication and when, that's part of, any reports that we would build. We want to show that as a, that's what did it and not other communications or other initiatives as part of it. So when we blend them, it does make it a little complicated, but it makes it interesting because there's a lot more we can do with the data. And the name by process and capabilities, and I'm assuming that's for underscore. So because again, we don't do the name by process currently for Gettysburg, but what we typically have, we have our enrollment strategy team that works with the school and actually help, they submit a form in our Slate instance. So we end up having that of all of the historical name buys information that they've done, what are your markets, numbers that you've traditionally bought, which sources you traditionally have. And we start evaluating that. So we work within the school, within that, the ACT or college board to evaluate what's available, what score bands they're looking to have, where they want to make those changes. Again, our team will end up building a Voyager report to kind of show them, are there certain pockets that are not being reached out to or certain pockets that need to have additional attention to. There's a lot that goes into that. And so we end up having additional calls just with that team outside of the communications team or outside of special projects that works with them on making sure they get, the students that they want, where they want, and how many they're actually looking to get. So it's a fairly involved process, and they make sure to have that, up and ready to go. And then once those names come in, so unless, again, every school's a little bit different, and I don't end up loading the names for Gettysburg, and I'm totally fine with that, but a lot of schools are very happy to have us load those names as well and do all the cleanup there. So if that's the case, so we get the names and we'll load those into the secure server. And so those will be waiting for us to load into school's instance, and then we remove them from any hard drives or anything they may be on to limit that exposure as well. So it lives as much as possible within your Slate instance and nowhere else. And so that data would stay there. So any other reports or queries that utilize that data, that's in there as well. And then we report off of that within the Slate instance. So we don't have to sideload Tableau or use up anything else to do reporting. Everything is within the Slate instance and accessible for a school. So the name by process is as integrated into Slate as anything else that we would do with any other project, essentially. I think that might be all the questions now. So again, our emails are on the screen as well. So if you do have any follow-up questions and you'd like to get some more information on anything we've talked today or anything else, please feel free to reach out. Again, Maggie and I really appreciate you attending the webinar. Having you join us, and again, any questions that come up, feel free to let us know.
Thanks so much, everyone.